And hello everyone, welcome back to another C++ tutorial. So in this tutorial we'll be talking about scopes. Take note, if you have not seen my video on functions yet, I do recommend you to. It's not required, but it will help you understand what's going on in this video. Alright, so what is scopes? Well, scopes is basically kind of a way of saying, okay, this is restricted to this code block. You'll hear about things like global scope and local scope, and we'll cover both of them. For example, this would be called a global scope variable. So let's say int x is equal to 15. Now int x can be accessed anywhere inside of this file. So if I were to go here and just say x plus 9, then that would work because x is global scope. And you can have as many global scope variables as you want, so we can even make this y, and we can say x plus y. That would still work perfectly fine. Like that. And then even if I create a function, so let's say here int sum, and let's just say num1 and num2, and here we say return num1 plus num2, right? And we should just probably specify that these two are integers, so int, and in here I would just say sum x y. That would work perfectly fine, just as we can see. And if we were to replace this with x and y, not even use that right there, so we can literally just pass in random values here just to make sure it is what we expect. Then we get 30, because these are global scope variables. They can be used from anywhere. If we say x, then it's going to look and it's going to find a global scope variable. It's usually not recommended, however, to use global scope variables. The main reason is just because they get in the way, and it's not good practice. Because let's say we have a global scope variable x and a local scope variable x. So let's say here we have int x is equal to 20. What's happening now? Now we have two x variables. If we save the code and we run it, we get 30. If we were going to pass in x and y in here, and we were to run this, what would we get? Would we get this x variable? Or will we get this x variable? Because this one will allow us to return 30, while this one will return 35. Well, let's see. So let's just turn these into nums. So num1 and num2. Otherwise we'll anyways just get 30. Like that. And now let's run it and see what we get. We get 35. And that's where it comes into play. Now I have a global scope variable x and a local scope variable x. And they're different numbers. But this one will always go for the local scope variable first, because it takes priority. It is part of this local scope. This x variable cannot be used inside of sum, because sum just isn't accessing this x here unless we pass it in here. If I were to comment out this x right there, sum would not know what x is if we did that. As you can see, we already get an error here. Identifier x is undefined because x doesn't exist in a global scope and x does not exist in the local scope here. So if we run this, we're going to get an error because what is x? And the same here. So let's say I were to go here and say int x is equal to num1. What now? Because now we have an x here and we have an x here. But this x is being redefined. So let's see what we get. We get 35. So that is kind of the difference between local and global scope, because a local scope variable is only accessible within its function or class, which we'll be getting into later. As you can see here, these x's can only be accessed within themselves, while this x right here can be accessed anywhere inside of this file, because it is a global scope variable, whilst this is a local scope variable. But what if you did want to actually pass in the global scope variable in here? What would we do then? Well, then we can add 2 colons here. These 2 colons will basically tell C++, hey, this should be a global scope, X, and not a local scope. And that means if we were to run this, we'll not get 35, but we'll get 30, because now we're specifically saying, use the global scope variable. So yeah, that's just the basics of it. It's also recommended to just use local scope variables, because 99% of the time you are able to just replace a global scope variable with something local by using classes or just declaring a local scope variable instead and maybe passing it into the function instead of trying to access it from outside. But yeah, for the most part, try to stick with local scope variables. But now you do know the difference between a local and a global scope variable. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you all again in the next C++ tutorial.